Welcome, welcome, everybody, to now day 2, where we are going to be talking about perspective and you. We're going to talk about a very brief definition of perspective, why it's important, and how it applies and what you can learn from and how you can use it. So, without further ado, let's start. So, perspective is the most powerful tool books have. There are, of course, many mediums of storytelling: film, television, movies, music. And a book's most powerful tool that it has over the other mediums of storytelling is perspective. Because in the other mediums, it is so hard to communicate a person's thoughts and introspection and then switch back to the events that are occurring to that character then in a more visual form. But in books, it is quite easy. And in fact, it is the most important tool you have to help color your writing and to effectively tell your story through the lens of character. In this lesson, when I talk about perspective, I'm talking about how a character sees the world. Because every person sees the world differently. We all have different experiences, different educational backgrounds, different classes, cultural differences. All of these ways that our life has been shaped affect how we see the world. And perspective is the term that we use to talk about how a story is being told by a character. And I think the most important thing that you need to take away from perspective is that it directly affects the language in which you write a story. This is where the technicality and the effectiveness of your writing, whether you're writing literary or fantasy or nonfiction, will really get to stretch its muscles. I really want to emphasize that perspective directly affects the language in which you write a story. So let's talk about that more. So if point of view defines who is telling the story, perspective tells us how the story is being told. Let me go ahead and move over here. The two big areas where perspective is going to truly express itself are interior monologue and descriptions. If you've ever read a first person novel, so a novel that uses I did this, I do that as its primary point of view, interior monologue is flushed into the text quite easily. While actions are happening to our protagonist is then commenting on the stuff that is happening. As I said before, perspective is the greatest tool that books have because it is so incredibly difficult to communicate the thoughts of an event that is happening and then switch to the immediate scene in the next sentence. I'm not saying it's impossible for visual mediums to do it, but for a book, it's quite natural. Descriptions. Now, this is something that is perhaps a little more advanced, but I think it's important to talk about. When we talk about how we describe things and how we describe places, how we describe objects, perspective warps the way we describe things. One of my favorite authors is Brandon Sanderson, and Brandon Sanderson talks about this writing exercise called A Stranger Walks into Town. The exercise is the following. You think about a place, whether it's fantastical, whether it's somewhere that's real, whatever you want to think about, you think about a place. Buildings, the people, what's going on in this city, so on and so forth. And then for the first part of the exercise, you describe a person who lives in this place coming into town. and just what they would say, just a short scene. Now, for someone who has lived in this town, they probably would recognize the place with familiarity. They would describe how the alleyways where he recognizes his neighbor's kids play. And they always play with, like, Beyblades, for example, in the alleys. And then he walks past, like, a farm, and he knows that, Miss and Mr. Sumire are baking apple spice donuts because of the fall season, right? This is somewhere, this is a person that lives here in this town. Now, after you write that scene, there's a secondary part of the scene, which is now you have to write a stranger walking into this same town. Now, the skill of the exercise is that the way that the person who lives there and a stranger walking in this town should be different, because there is no longer any familiarity. This is the person might smell the apple spice donuts or the apple spice goods, but for him, all they are smells. What would this stranger notice the most about walking to this place? And then you could repeat this exercise with different perspectives. What if a beggar is walking through this town for the first time? Right? What if a very wealthy man is walking through this town for the first time? Our perspective warps the way we describe things, and descriptions and how we describe objects, places, and things that happen are often more telling about the perspective that we are operating on than just describing the thing, if that makes sense. And so the last note I want to talk about is that perspective tells the reader a character's interpretation of the world. And I want to do an example of from a book that we will be book clubbing about this Thursday called The Spear Cuts Through Water. And I want you guys to really process the event. Like, it is out of context, right? But I want you guys to try to pick up on the perspective of this character and what they think about themselves, even though they're not talking about themselves. Because perspective has a really interesting superpower, which is that mastering perspective lets you get away with murder and play with the quote-unquote rules of writing. When we talk about writing, we often hear a lot of rules. We often hear, don't use adverbs. Oh, you shouldn't describe every person with like them looking into a mirror, right? You will hear so many quote unquote rules about writing, and some of those rules, are effective. Like, you should probably not depend on adverbs. You probably shouldn't only describe characters by them looking into mirrors and creating situations where mirrors exist. But the thing about perspective is perspective lets you break those rules, because as long as it's understood that we are describing things through the lens of character and how they see the world, suddenly it's interesting. And before I move on to the next slide, let's get to the example here. So this is just a random passage that I picked out that I think expresses this well. I want you guys to just think about how you think this character thinks about themselves, even though they're not talking about themselves. Before he entered, he looked at the person at his side who was supposedly his grandchild. The young man's face was obscured by the peacock mask, so if there was any resemblance between the two of them, the Emperor could not see it. But what he could see was the toll that the 6 months down here had taken on him. A nervous energy radiated from the young man's shoulder. His hands kept flexing, as if to work the tightness in the joints that would not leave, and he seemed to turn his head slightly at sounds only he could hear. The boy was not the first to fall prey to the madness of solitude, especially not in this cavern, not in this silence. But the Emperor was none the less disappointed that someone of his blood had proven to be so weak. It was just as well that he had forgotten this creature's name. Stop. Right? So let's talk about some of the things that we can immediately gather from this description of an event. So this is just a description of action that is happening. But I want you guys to focus on how perspective affects how we describe things. Because we are in the point of view of, if you don't know, we're talking about this emperor character in this book, right? So first things first that I highlighted is you always hear, especially avoid adverbs, but we have this adverb supposedly here. But as I said before, perspective lets you cheat. Because what does this adverb do here? When he says he looked at the person at his side who was supposedly his grandchild, right? What does that tell you about the emperor and how he regards his family? Just in that one sentence, with that one word, all of a sudden, even though as writers, we try not to depend on adverbs, because we're operating through the lens of perspective, and that this is the character that's talking, suddenly it's like, I don't think this guy cares about his family. And that is especially going to be true later when we get to the last sentence, right? How powerful has this word suddenly become of supposedly when we usually try to avoid? Suddenly it's very powerful. Because through the lens of perspective, we kind of see how this guy thinks. Let's keep on going. The young man's face was obscured by the peacock mask, so if there was any resemblance between the two of them, the emperor could not see it. For what he could see was told the six winds had down here taken him. Now, we're going to get to this underlined part here. A nervous energy radiated from the young man's shoulder. His hand kept flexing, as if to work the tightness in the joints that would not leave. I want to stop right there before we get to the next part here, because I think that part is the most important, right? How old do you think the emperor is if he's talking about working tightness in joints that would not leave? That's a very specific metaphor. Again, this is the strength of perspective, and once you learn how to master it, you can start doing this, right? When we use metaphors and analogies, you shouldn't just use them willy-nilly. You want them to relate back to the character of something that they would feel. Of course, in the context clues of like the parts back, we know that the emperor is old, right? But in this, I'm just taking this from a random passage. But that specific example of working tightness in joints that would not leave, I would imagine that that is something that those who struggle with the depths of age work with the most, right? We also know that this guy's kind of perceptive. Nervous energy radiated from a young man's shoulder. His hands kept flexing, right? There's a lot of key elements that, because perspective shapes the way we describe things that happen, we get to play with rules. We get to play with language. Let's keep on going, right? The boy was not the first to fall prey to the madness of solitude, especially not in this cavern, not in this silence. All right, I'm going to stop there too. Especially not in this cavern, especially not in this silence. So here's the thing, guys. Here's the thing. Everyone has, if you haven't heard this before, you'll always heard that forced exposition, in which we start hearing the author just like put a giant information block in front of you, takes you out of the book. And I agree for the most part, right? Like if we mention very casually, like, oh yeah, dwarves used to live here, and then have like a 3-page history of the dwarves, that's very distracting, because we think to ourselves, why does this matter here? Who's even talking right now? But here's the thing about perspective, because again, I want to stress this enough. If you can master perspective and master character talk and interior dialogue and characterizing through descriptions, you're able to break rules because the readers understand that it's not the author talking, it's the character thinking and the character talking. And we like to learn about characters and how they talk. So, prior to this, especially not in this cavern, not in this silence, if I just put a giant like block of text saying about how quiet this cavern is, how why this cavern is as quiet as it is, why it's a bad place. That could take the reader out. But because in a very few concise words, the boy was not the first to fall prey to the madness of solitude, especially not in this cavern, not in this silence. Right? That gives us an entire history of what this character thinks about this place that they are in through the lens of character. And then finally, we can finish off the last of the paragraph here. But the emperor was nonetheless disappointed that someone of his blood had proven to be so weak. It was just as well that he had forgotten this creature's name. This is the strength of mastering character voice. We opened this paragraph with, before he entered, he looked at the person at his side who was supposedly his grandson. That clues us in as like, hey, I don't think this guy thinks very much about his family. And then, of course, we're right. It was just as well that he had forgotten this creature's name. Perspective shapes the way we describe things. I want you to really hammer that in. If you know what your character is about, if you know the beliefs that they have, the doctrine they've been raised in, what they think about themselves, culture, character class, wealth, if you can really dial that in for your characters, it really lets you play with language. It really lets you go to town with how these people will describe the things around them. This man is describing his grandchild as a creature. I want you to think about that. And what he thinks is that he's disappointed that in this place where apparently it's pretty normal for people to fall to madness because of loneliness, because of the silence, that he still considers this person weak of mind. He's disappointed. Think about how strong this verb is, right? That is operating here. He was nonetheless disappointed. Not empathetic, not appreciative. He is disappointed that someone of his blood had proven to be so weak. So, again, you guys, I want you guys to really think about your character and about the perspective they live in, that they operate in, how they interpret the world, and let that color the language of your writing when you write through their perspective. That is the number one thing I want you guys to take away from this lesson. If you're still here watching, I'll go ahead and move so you guys can see the graphic. There you go. Thank you for watching. You can follow me on Twitch. And I'm going to be posting these videos on my writing channel, Ulysses_WC, on my YouTube. So like and subscribe there. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.